Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brian Tremont. I'm the managing partner at Wilkinson Barker Nauer, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to Hudson Institute's discussion of competition in the wireless space today. Our speaker is former Commissioner Harold Furchtgott-Roth, who is a senior fellow here at the Institute, as well as running his own economic consulting firm. As I mentioned, he's a former FCC commissioner. He also serves on the Department of Commerce's Spectrum Management Advisory Committee, among a host of other spectrum-related expertise. I had the pleasure of working with Commissioner Furchtgott-Roth for a number of years at the FCC and witnessing firsthand his view on many of these issues related to merger review, the role of government in setting spectrum policy. And he consistently has offered a clear vision that is often proven prescient in subsequent market developments during the course of his time both at the FCC and as a commentator on these issues. We were visiting a bit before we sat down today and reflecting, and perhaps most significantly on the Time Warner AOL merger back in the late 1990s, when the commission imposed a condition on instant messaging. And Commissioner Furchtgott-Roth took to the airwaves and spoke aggressively about the fact that we didn't know what the instant messaging market was going to look like, or if there indeed would be one, and that government intervention in that case was premature and reflected a lack of humility on the government's part about the pace and tack of technological change. He has certainly been proven correct in that observation, and I think his comments today will perhaps may offer a similar sort of warning sign to policymakers as they consider additional market movement in the wireless space. So I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner. We'll have some time at the end for audience questions. But for now, I'll turn it over to Commissioner Furchtgott-Roth.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for that very kind introduction. A couple of housekeeping matters. First of all, you have questions for the online viewing audience. You can submit questions at Twitter at hudson.org, and you can also watch this proceeding, and then in July 18th, we're going to have Professor Bruce Owen from Stanford University, who's going to speak about a favorite topic of mine, corruption. So we look forward to seeing you then, and I'll have other programs to announce next month. Brian asked me a few months ago to write a short piece for the Federalist Society about competition in the wireless industry, and that spurred this talk today. A few years ago, or actually as recently as 12 months ago, it would have been a simple story to tell that the wireless industry is fiercely competitive, that it has all the characteristics of a competitive market. Losses are more common than profits. There's substantial entry and exit. There's substantial innovation. I'm sure all of you have handsets that are less than 2 years old, that use network facilities that are less than 2 years old, and anything older than that would be obsolete. The big winner in the wireless space for the past 20 years has been the American consumer. The American consumer has benefited from innovations, from higher qualities of service, from lower prices, and from very fierce competition. The simple admonition for the government for the past 20 years has been, leave it alone, don't interfere, don't get in the way. And for 20 years, the federal government did get out of the way. Regulation of the wireless sector has been minimal. The federal government has reviewed dozens of mergers in the wireless sector over the past 20 years, and until last year had delayed and imposed some conditions and imposed some costs, but it had essentially not blocked any merger. That was until a year ago. The federal government didn't say there's a lack of competition in the wireless industry, nor did the federal government say that there was something inherently wrong with either of the two merging companies. What the federal government said, at least in the DOJ complaint, which was echoed few months later in the FCC staff report, is that there's something magical about 4 firms in the industry. 4 firms. There are hundreds of firms in the industry, but there are 4 that are magical, and you cannot remove one of those firms without destroying competition. This was a very dramatic change, and I don't think there's been a lot of attention focused on this different view of the structure of the industry. And this was both at the FCC and the Department of Justice. The identity of the firms involved in the merger almost don't matter, because if you use the logic that's in the DOJ antitrust complaint and the logic that's in the FCC staff complaint, they would have blocked any combination of those 4 firms. The 4 firms were in. What were excluded were a large number of other firms. Firms that were smaller, facilities-based firms that were smaller. MVNOs were excluded, resellers were excluded, mobile satellite service firms that were on the edge that were either getting in or anticipating to get in, such as what was Light Squared, which is now in bankruptcy, EchoStar, Charlie Ergen's firm, which is hoping to get in. Any number of other firms at the edge were excluded. The entire sector of nomadic Wi-Fi based on wireline services were excluded. A lot of firms that helped to discipline the wireless sector were excluded.
Can we pause on that just for a second?
Sure.
So I think their theory was, right, that it was a national market. And so that was sort of the turning point, was this discussion that somehow that there become a national market, and that as opposed to a highly localized one. Can you talk a little bit about that element of their analysis and why you don't believe that to be the right way to look at this?
That was a novel change also from prior antitrust reviews and from prior FCC merger reviews, that previously it had been on a sort of a local, regional basis. I'm actually not convinced that looking at it nationally is entirely wrong. I think parts of it, in terms of wireless carriers as purchasers of equipment, it's done on a national basis. A lot of them set national rate plans. So some of it does make sense on a national basis. To look at spectrum is a highly localized matter. Marketing is a localized matter. So it's a combination of the two. But they excluded some national. They excluded Clearwire, the national firm. They excluded MVNOs and resellers like TracFone, which is the 4th or 5th largest firm in the country. It's available nationwide. They excluded firms such as Leap and Metro and U.S. Cellular, which have, if not quite a national footprint, very close to it. And so the firms that were excluded were not excluded just because they weren't national. At least I don't think. I'm somewhat reminded of a book that was written about 20 years ago by Francis Fukuyama. It was, I think, provocatively entitled "The End of History." And it traces the political, philosophical debates over the past 3 millennia about what is the best form of government, and dating back to Plato. And Professor Fukuyama reaches the conclusion that the fall of the Soviet Empire is this moment in time that defines representative democracy as just the best form of government, and that will never be displaced, and that this sort of ends this philosophical debate once and for all. The announcement that there are 4 firms that are magically central to the wireless industry is, in some sense, an analogy to saying we've reached the end of history, that we've reached the end of competition in the wireless sector, that nothing else really matters, nothing can displace them. Because once you admit the possibility that something could displace one or all of these firms, then what you're really saying is DOJ and the FCC got things wrong last year, because the potential to displace them undermines the entire structure of their argument. Well, why is it important that competition in the wireless sector not be over, that we have not reached the end of history? And there are 3 points I want to make today about that. One is that the wireless sector is extremely important to the economic health of the United States. It is one of the very few sectors of the economy that has actually been growing. The second point I want to make is I'm increasingly concerned that the ex-ante merger review in industries with rapid technological change are subject to problem. If one goes back and looks at the merger reviews, at least in the telecommunications industry over the past 20 years, one reaches a very troubling conclusion that these don't make a lot of sense. And it's not, for years I've had that view about FCC merger reviews. I'm just not even sure the antitrust agencies can do much better. And the reason is the rapid technological change. It's as Brian said, when you look at AOL, Time Warner in the year 2000 and 2001, and you think, oh wow, instant messaging is going to be this really important new technology, or we need to set aside certain bandwidth for ISPs to have open access. And you impose these conditions thinking you understand what technology is, and it turns out technology veers off in some radically different direction. Well, those aren't exceptions. Those turn out to be the rules of looking at ex-ante merger review in industries with rapidly changing technology, which is the wireless sector. The third thing is that to the extent the government is concerned about anti-competitive behavior, and I suspect there is a lot of anti-competitive behavior that goes on, that correcting that is probably much better done on an ex-post basis than an ex-ante basis. And it's interesting, that's precisely what DOJ and the FTC have done in other high-tech industries, is they're very focused on ex-post. Now, I'm not convinced they do a good job of that either, and that's a separate issue altogether. But at least you can define the problems better, I think, on an ex-post than on an ex-ante basis. Well, why is the wireless sector important to the U.S. economy? The wireless sector had double-digit economic growth from the time the federal government began measuring it, which was in 1992, just several years after it really began, up through 2007. It was in the 20% annual growth rate through much of the 90s. It was above 10% through much of the 2000s. It has slowed down. Now, this was a time when the U.S. economy as a whole was growing at about 3% a year. So if you look at the end of the recession in the early 90s, 1992, through the end of the last economic expansion in 2007, the U.S. economy grew at about 3% per year. The wireless sector was growing at several times that rate. Since the recession began, up until now, the U.S. economy has grown at zero on it. For the past 5 years, U.S. economic real growth is zero. Wireless sector growth is about 4% per year. It's much slower than it was before, but it still is growing. You take the wireless sector out of the U.S. economy, it's negative growth. I'm not suggesting any type of technological, any sort of industrial policy treat wireless differently from the rest. What I am saying is when the government steps in to interfere with it, bad things happen. So you probably don't want to do anything to harm it. Well, why has it been growing so fast? One of the main reasons is technological change. As I described before, the innovation in the industry has been substantial. Technological obsolescence for equipment and network. And there's been a convergence, both a convergence and a divergence of technology in the industry.
Before we get to the slide real quick,
Sure.
I just have a couple of quick questions. So you mentioned about why it has been growing so fast. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the evolution of the market since the sort of two cellular carriers, highly fragmented, to today? And also the role, one thing that people have consistently been saying a lot about is that the one government role that is essential here is putting spectrum into the marketplace that allows the wireless industry to grow. So just a little bit about market structure and sort of how we've evolved and what the commission's view has been on that, or antitrust review has been on that. And then the second piece, sort of the role of spectrum.
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, back in the 80s, roughly contemporaneous with the breakup of AT&T, the commission allocated 2 licenses for what was then called cellular service. And over time, more and more spectrum has been made available for a wide range of services, and many firms have entered the market, many firms have left the market. And so what began as a duopoly that was completely structured with licenses assigned just by the FCC has it's a constant problem. Has evolved over time to be a much more complex market, and the initial allocations of the government are hard to trace at this point in time.
When it's sort of an interesting element of what we described before, which is the government, I think, anticipated a highly localized market for wireless, and so the licensing was done on a highly localized basis. And it's another example of how sort of the market changed dramatically, and there were a lot of transaction costs associated with assembling what ended up being nationwide business licenses or nationwide licenses to conduct their wireless business. So it's another actually interesting.
That's right. If you look at the early 90s, there weren't really any national wireless carriers. The evolution of nationwide wireless service really took place in the 90s, with some of it was the swapping of licenses among carriers, and some of it was consolidation within the industry. What was the second question?
Well, actually, and just I'll ask one more follow-up before we get to the second question, which the other interesting thing is, to the extent that the end of history is with 4, which is part of your thesis today, it's interesting. In 99, you could have said, if someone had declared the end of history, it would have been 6.
Right.
In 97, it might have been 8. So there certainly has not, the static view has certainly not been the way the wireless industry has evolved over time. So it's interesting. Now, some might argue that the consolidation is the reason to stop at 4, that all of this consolidation has led to a point now that 4 is the tipping point. We've let too much happen today.
Right.
What is your answer to those critics?
Well, it may or may not be true, but I don't think there's any compelling empirical evidence. For example, I don't think there's any empirical evidence that pricing policies became less friendly when we moved from 8 to 7, from 7 to 6, from 6 to 5, from 5 to 4. I'm not convinced we have 4. I think if I did a count, I would find dozens of firms in the market. And I think that's more consistent with the empirical observation that it's just cutthroat competitive out there.
And the second follow-up question was about the importance of government's role in putting spectrum into the market in terms of facilitating the kind of growth that you were talking about. What they've done and what they need to continue to do.
I think they need to get as much spectrum in the market as possible. It's not doing a lot of good in other areas, and I think actually the best thing they could do would be to what I would characterize as de-zoning spectrum, to get away from saying you can use this spectrum for just the following uses. If you de-zoned it, I think you would solve a lot of the spectrum shortage problems.
Now, you wouldn't de-zone the federal users, I presume. DoD
No.
probably would not appreciate being de-zoned.
No, I don't. But I think you could de-zone broadcast spectrum immediately, and I think you would solve a lot of problems immediately.
Back to your slide.
Now, what I have on this slide is 5 columns, and let's look at what might have been called the traditional wireless industry, which would be from the first. You pick one of these from each column. So we pick the fourth from the transmission medium, which is terrestrial wireless. We pick the second from the mobility column, which is mobile. We pick, let's call it, the second from the network, which would be public switch. Let's say we have a service which is two-way, the second one, and the first on the content, voice audio. That was the traditional mobile wireless industry. But I think you can pick and choose almost any combination of these. Well, you can't get mobility out of copper or coaxial cable or fiber, I'll grant you that. But there are a lot of combinations here that you can do, and the net result is there are a lot of different service offerings out in the market. And I'm going to talk more about what I see as the increasing substitutability between mobile and nomadic services, which brings in just a wide range of services. 5 years ago, or certainly 10 years ago, if I had asked how many of you have Wi-Fi on your handset, most of you, 10 years ago, you probably wouldn't have even heard of Wi-Fi. But today, Wi-Fi is on almost any device, whether it's a handset or a tablet or an iPod or your laptop. So there's both a convergence and a divergence here with the traditional terrestrial wireless services going into a lot of different areas, and other services becoming, in some ways, competitive and substitutes for traditional wireless service. Well, what's driving technological change in the industry? Well, some of it is speed and capacity. That's true on both the wireless and the wireline side. On the wireless side, it's both mobility as well as wireless local area networks, sort of nomadic capability. If you go to the website for any major manufacturer, go to Apple's website. For every product that has a wireless mobile capability, they will show it on the exact same page with the capability of Wi-Fi. To Apple, it makes no difference whether they're selling a product, a piece of equipment that has mobility capabilities or nomadic capability. The industry structure is also not narrowly based on just wireless only. There's some wireless only companies, but there are also a lot of companies that are integrated into wireline and other services. And increasingly, there are very few wireline only companies as well, and some have merged in and merged out. But it's hard to look at the industry structure and say, aha, here's the wireless industry just based on the industry structure itself. I think this is particularly true of wireline and wireless. Back in 1992, it was really easy to define the differences between wireline and wireless. Over time, it's become a lot different, at least from a user perspective. Wireless nationwide calls, you really couldn't do that in 1992. Wireless calls that bypass the public switch telephone network. It was hard to do that in 2002. It's really easy to do that today. Wireless internet access, it was just starting in 2002. Today, everybody does it. Wi-Fi integrated handsets, it really just started about 5 years ago. Wi-Fi integrated into laptops, again, sort of the same time frame. You can see this particularly with again, if you look at Apple as sort of the prototypical manufacturing company and the integration of Wi-Fi to their products, that really begins at the end of 2006, beginning of 2007. Today, they're ubiquitous. It's just you cannot find consumer electronic product at Apple that doesn't have Wi-Fi capabilities, whether it's iPod, iPad, iPhone, any of the laptops. And 6 years ago, it just wasn't there.
May I ask a couple questions
Sure.
about that? So one thing, you've mentioned Apple now a number of times, and the rise of Apple as a player in the wireless market is not something that's sort of taken into account as part of the antitrust review, for example. And arguably, they have had the most powerful single product in the wireless marketplace in the last decade with the iPhone. So talk a little bit about the role of manufacturers in this ecosystem and how it is a driver of competition that's sort of divorced from the carriers in some ways. And what you see, the fact that the rapid technological change associated with iPods with iPhones, as well as, for example, the rise of the Droid, and how the sort of handset element of this plays into your larger point.
I think if you were to look at the different sectors have cycles, if you will, and the manufacturing sector did very well in the 90s. A lot of firms went into bankruptcy in the late 90s, early 2000s. It was not a good time to be a manufacturer of consumer electronic equipment or of network equipment. In the past 5 years, the manufacturers have done very well, or at least certain manufacturers have done very well. Apple, Samsung, LG. Others are having a very tough time. But if you look at the overall market cap of the manufacturers, that has actually gone up in the past 5 years, and arguably on the service side, it hasn't gone up.
I think,
yeah.
I was going to say, many argue, right, that consumers are more interested in what their device looks like than which network they're on. At least some consumers care more about their device than they do about which network they're on.
I think they care about both, but I think a lot of the when a carrier gets money, a lot of the money immediately gets handed over to the manufacturer, and they're both very competitive. I don't mean to suggest otherwise. They're both very, very competitive industries. But I think you're right that the manufacturers very much influence the shape of the service industry and the products that are there and are driving a lot of consumer demand.
One other interesting observation with the Wi-Fi issue that you flagged is that there was a time when there was thought about a regulatory mandate to require Wi-Fi capabilities in handsets. And needless to say, the market appears to have responded to consumer demand in that regard without the need for a mandate. So it was interesting that at one point some policymakers thought that was something they would need to require in the marketplace as opposed to letting it evolve naturally. So
yeah, somehow putting requirements on service providers to do something that consumers want rarely is necessary. I think the consumers want it. There's also increasing blurring of the distinction between wireless and the broadband industry. It's very difficult to speak of the broadband industry today without also speaking of wireless, both on the demand side, that consumers want broadband for their wireless devices, and also on the supply side. If you're an internet website, you want your site to be accessible on the web. You want to have applications that are designed for mobile users or nomadic users. I want to emphasize that as well. And you want to have applications that make sense on potentially a small screen size. This is a chart of IPOs since 1992, and those that are from that have been characterized as internet IPOs. And I put this in, I won't call it a proxy for wireless, but I do think it is a proxy for the importance of the communications sector in IPOs, sort of the health of innovation for publicly traded companies. What's interesting to me is we all talk about the internet bubble as being in the late kind of 2000, 2001 time period. And it's true if you look at the IPOs in 1999, 2000, internet IPOs accounted for really a disproportionate number of the total IPOs in the United States. But what's striking to me is beyond that point, from 2001 up until 2011, it's been remarkably stable at between, roughly 5 and 10% of IPOs in the United States are internet-based, and a lot of those include wireless companies as well. So, yes, there was an internet bubble, but the internet communications technology sector continues to be an important part of the economy. But it's not that it's just all success stories. There have been a lot of failures. You have both entry and you have a lot of exits from the industry. There were many fixed wireless companies that went out of business. Northpoint, Windstar, Intelligent, Exo, all of these had bankruptcies. Paging industry, which was a separate industry and had separate merger reviews in the 1990s, as late as 2001 or 2. Lots of bankruptcies. Even on the mobile side, Leaf Wireless was in bankruptcy in 2003, 2004. LightSquared has just gone into bankruptcy. Smaller companies have gone in and out of bankruptcy. So it's all of these are indicia of competition. The FCC itself, every year for the past 15 years, has had a competition report on the wireless industry and consistently finds either competition or it fails to find an absence of competition. I'll put it that way. And throughout this time, the Commission has looked at industry structure, provider conduct, performance, consumer behavior. It's very difficult to look at anything the Commission has put in these reports and find anything short of really pretty substantial competition. The measures, whether it's falling prices, increasing quality of service, constant innovation, lack of industry profits, substantial entry and exit, substantial substitution from wireline, all of these are indicators of competition in the wireless sector. The bottom line is that the wireless sector is important to the U.S. economy. The technological change is rapid and key to the U.S. economy. The technological change blurs historical industry boundaries, and that competition has been intense in this sector. Let me just briefly touch on the ex-ante merger reviews at both the FCC and DOJ and why I think they've been problematic and why I think it's difficult for them to deal with rapidly changing technology. I've gone back and looked at a lot of the FCC merger reviews over the past 20 years, and I put them into some categories. First of all, before 1980, there were no merger reviews because these were all sort of regulated monopolies, or in broadcasting you could own a couple of stations, but you could never really own more than a handful. 1981 to 1995, you have a handful of merger reviews as you have the initial phases of deregulation and the initial phases of new industries such as cable and satellite coming online. But you still have very substantial wireline price regulation. Wireline competition is just getting started, and the wireless sector is still just taking off. 96 to 2008, the beginning of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, up through the past few years, you actually have many mergers per year. Averaging FCC reviews are probably in the 10 per year range, roughly one a month. Wireline price regulation at the federal level practically disappears. It's primarily at the state level. There's tariffing, but not a lot of actual rate regulation. Wireline competition develops very rapidly, and essentially there's no wireless price regulation at all. For the past 3 years, we've seen actually very few merger reviews at the FCC. It's fallen by more than half. We've started to see substantial price regulation on the wireline side again. Wireline competition has matured. Wireless price regulation of some sort is under consideration. And during this time period, you see, again, in these time periods, wireless competition went from being prescribed before 1980 to heavily regulated in the following period to completely deregulated. And it's increasingly integrated into the wireline. It now is by the way, it's, in 2008, it passed the wireline in terms of value added. The internet follows a similar pattern, commercial explosion after 96, and the value of internet companies now surpasses substantially communication companies. Technological change has just been explosive in the communication sector since 1990. What I've done here is shown the market capitalization of selected firms as of last Friday. It would be a similar pattern if I did the enterprise value, but didn't want to have to fool with exactly what was the debt for each of these companies. Now, what I've done is I put network operators in the first column, and I've included the Magic Four: AT&T, Verizon. T-Mobile is a subsidiary of Deutsche Telekom. The $35 billion market cap for Deutsche Telekom is worldwide. So the U.S. market cap of that is some percentage on who knows what that is. And then Sprint is one of the Magic Four down at the bottom of the column at $9 billion. Brian was asking me about the shift in the importance of the manufacturers. I haven't listed, these are just selected firms. These aren't all of the firms, not all the network operators, manufacturers, content. But what I wanted to show is that there are a lot of really valuable manufacturing companies out there. And there are a lot of companies that are much larger than all but the top few network companies. And I don't mean to suggest by any stretch of the imagination that these are all the manufacturers. And these are only the U.S.-based manufacturers. Manufacturing is definitely a global marketplace. And if you included Asian and European companies on there, there would be a bunch of other large companies there as well. Content, and I haven't really talked a lot about that, but again, there are a lot of really large content companies which are much larger than the network operator. So there's, over the past 10 years, I'd say there's been a shift in the relative valuation away from network operators towards manufacturers and content. And yet we have a lot of focus on ex-ante merger review on the network operator side. Not that I'm suggesting we need more on the other guys, don't mistake me, but we really are focusing a lot of attention on the network operator side, which is in some ways not as valuable as other sectors. if we look at the merger review process at the FCC from 97 to 2010, and there really weren't a lot of merger reviews before 97. The FCC rejected 2 out of 94, and those 2 are, I think, somewhat instructive. One was WorldCom Sprint in 2000. WorldCom was going to acquire Sprint. The FCC blocked it. Well, actually, DOJ blocked it because it was going to monopolize the long-distance market. There used to be something called distance market. There used to be a company called WorldCom. WorldCom went into bankruptcy less than 3 years after DOJ blocked this merger. I say that not as a criticism of DOJ at the time, although I did right at the time how wrong-headed it was. But I certainly had no greater knowledge of what the future technology would be. The other merger that was blocked during this period was DirecTV EchoStar. And then we come to 2011. There were 6 mergers reviewed by the FCC in 2011, and the commission blocked one of those. So there are a lot of mergers that are reviewed, a lot of information that is the commission reviews, and but blocking mergers is actually not common part of what they do. But if you look back at what the commission has done, it's hard to look at the market definitions that the commission has had over time and think that they make a lot of sense. It's hard to look at the conditions the commission puts on mergers and think that they made a lot of sense. And it's not because the agency isn't trying. It's not because the people there are not extraordinarily bright and clever and capable. It's because it's really hard to predict where technology is going to go. And when you do these types of merger reviews, it's hard to avoid the historical review and not look a little bit silly. One of the other unfortunate precedents is there were a couple of paging mergers, 2000, 2001, 2002. And again, this sort of separate market for not just paging, but sort of one-way paging is one market, two-way paging is another market. They're gone. And it's not that the FCC applies these with great rigor or that DOJ does. If you look at the recent 2009-2010 DOJ antitrust merger review, it describes various tests. One is the small but significant non-transient increase in price test. FCC never really does that. Hypothetical monopolist test. Not going to find that. Critical loss analysis. Not very often. Econometric estimation of demand. That's what I would really like to see. Where's the demand for this? What's going to happen? Because I think if you did a demand on the wireless side, I think you would actually find as part of a broader demand for communication services. I think the demand for all of these services are interrelated, and it's very difficult to disentangle. And if you look at wireless by itself, I think you're really missing a lot of what's going on in the market.
So just to unpack that slightly, so that you would suggest that if someone were to have applied the right test to AT&T T-Mobile, what would that test have looked like under that final paradigm that you were just describing?
I think there's a much broader communications sector demand. Now, within that, you might potentially find a narrower antitrust market, but I don't think it's as narrow as 4 firms. I cannot tell you how problematic I think saying there are 4 magical firms in the world. it really, as an economist, I find that very disturbing. And that was the next punchline. It's DOJ's view is AT&T and T-Mobile are two of only four mobile wireless providers with nationwide networks, which is just false. There's more nationwide networks than that, and a variety of competitive attributes associated with that national scale and presence. DOJ doesn't do any of the tests, or they don't do them right. I'll put it that way. But we don't really know because all we have is the complaint. The FCC in its staff report tries to introduce some of this analysis, which the FCC rarely does. But I just don't think it's right. I don't think what they came up with is right. If we look at how the commission looks at spectrum input, which it does in various wireless mergers, again, I don't think that's right. They include cellular, PCS, SMR, 700 megahertz in parts of AW, parts of BRS. But they exclude a lot of other spectrum. They exclude much of the Clearwire spectrum. They exclude the ATC mobile satellite service spectrum. They exclude most of AWS. They exclude all of WCS. And it's just not really clear why they include some spectrum and not others. Finally, I just want to briefly touch on what I think, if the government is concerned about anti-competitive behavior, that I think they should focus more on ex post rather than ex ante review. I think it's difficult to look at the history of FTC DOJ reviews and not come to the conclusion there have been a lot of false concerns and also potentially a lot of misconcerns. And if you're concerned about market behavior, it's much easier to observe that going on today or in the past than it is to project what you think it might possibly be in the future. And it's interesting that that's exactly what DOJ and the FTC have done in other high-tech industries, whether it's software providers, operating systems for Microsoft, internet search, concerns with Google. These have been ex post concerns. These have not been ex ante at the time of some merger. And I have no view about the merits of whether DOJ has done those reviews properly or not. I actually have some concerns about them. But I think conceptually, doing things on an ex post basis probably does make a lot more sense. Then at least you're focusing on potential real concerns rather than ex ante merger reviews where all too often, as in the case of instant messaging, I think you wind up focusing on imagined concerns, things that just never really develop. And so at the end, I guess my conclusion is I don't think we've reached the end of history. I think that the wireless sector, in fact, I think the entire communication sector is very competitive. It is extraordinarily innovative, and I think it's extraordinarily important to the health of the American economy, and that's why I think the government role in these sectors is it's important to get it right, and more often than not, the right government view here is going to be to leave it alone. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Brian.
All right, well, maybe I'll ask one question, then we'll open it up to the audience for some additional questions. So if we move to this ex post review regime, do you see anything in the marketplace? Well, so how would it work? Let's say you were reviewing Verizon Spectrum Co., for example, under this regime. There would be no ex ante requirements put on the transaction, presumably. You would approve the transaction and look to see what the marketplace looked like and for anti-competitive behavior downstream. Is that a fair way to describe how it would work?
I think from an FCC perspective, it's reasonable to check to see if the companies are complying with existing commission rules. I think that's perfectly reasonable for regulatory agency. But I probably would be skeptical of trying to project what the market is going to look like in the future.
Very good. All right. Well, why don't we open it up to a couple questions from the audience? Oh, here comes the mic. We have somebody up front here. Okay. Ask him.
Christy Muth, Hudson Institute. A two-part question, Harold. Are you the difference between your ex-ante and ex-post antitrust reviews is mergers, right? Just to be clear, Microsoft. The complaint about Microsoft was not. It didn't have anything to do with a merger.
Right.
It was just It was a conduct case. So, are you proposing to do away with all pre-merger review, or just in this industry, or just in rapidly changing industries, or do you want to abolish the procedure of review before mergers are consummated and leave it until later to decide whether a monopoly has been created and then face the question of what a remedy would be after the merger had been consummated? Second one, just to make this question even more pointed, would you be comfortable if we took these if the four firms were all to merge? Would you be comfortable with that merger and just kind of wait and see what happens?
Let me begin with the first question. I'm not suggesting to do away with Clayton antitrust law or Hart-Scott-Rodino merger review. And what I'm saying is, I think that in fairly stable industries, it's a lot easier to do this type of ex-ante review than it is in industries with rapidly changing technology. So if two major retailers, if Walmart and JCPenney want to merge, technology I don't think is changing nearly as rapidly, and I think the antitrust agencies would have a certain view of that. If Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola wanted to merge, I think the antitrust agencies would have a certain view of that. The second question you have is, would I be comfortable with all four firms merging together? And I'm not trying to suggest that that you do away with the merger review process altogether. I am suggesting a certain humility on the part of the government to say, if you're going to do this merger review, don't base it on speculation about what future markets are going to look like. That somehow that we know that the government has some ideas to what these future markets are going to be, and then moreover sort of frankly manipulate the data to sort of say, well, we're going to exclude a lot of the existing competitors in the market, and we have no idea what the future competitors in the market are going to look like, and so we're going to come up with a certain answer. The simple answer would be, if all four of these firms decided they wanted to merge, yeah, I think the government would have a problem with that. I think I would have a problem with that. I think everybody would have a problem with that. I'm not suggesting some nonsensical outcome. But I think the particular analysis that DOJ and the FCC came up with last year was based on a certain view of the world that I just don't think makes a lot of sense. I would have been a lot more comfortable if they'd said, we're going to reject this for the following reason. You know, we found some memos that the company said, oh, they're going to be able to do this and we're going to raise prices 1,000% or something like that. All right, fine, you know, that's it. That's not why they rejected the merger. They rejected the merger because they said there's a magical 4.
They didn't do any market share.
They did, but they're all wrong. They got the numbers exactly, positively wrong. Not approximately right, exactly wrong. Because they sort of said, we know these are the firms that are in, all of these other firms that are out, we're not going to count.
Is it fair to, so it seems like there are 2 buckets of things we're talking about here. There is the predictive judgment question about what the market is going to look like. Instant messaging and others things we've talked about is the government's very bad at that as a general matter and shouldn't try to use its crystal ball to impose conditions on deals. Then the second piece, which I think you were just touching on, is this sort of, is oddly inverse to that, which is that they adopt a very narrow view about what the market looks like today, for example, in the paging context, and only look sort of myopically at this narrow market segment and don't have a broad enough view of what the overall market will look, or could look like, sort of a potential for entry. Is that are those 2 fair buckets to talk about? And in the way it's the question that just came in over Twitter, I think touches on the second bucket, which is the sort of the way they myopically look at the current marketplace. For a while, you might recall in some of the competition reports, the commission divided up the marketplace into prepaid and postpaid, for example, and started talking about those sorts of as if they might be separate markets. And the question came in sort of how do prepaid iPhone and evolving more robust wireless broadband prepaid options impact sort of some of this assessment? So we haven't talked a lot about pricing, actually, as part of our discussion this afternoon. So maybe talk about pricing and particularly how it impacts sort of that assessment. I think pricing certainly is one of the factors that drove the paging market to where it landed because of the very aggressive pricing among traditional wireless providers made paging a less necessary economic alternative. But let me talk a little bit about the role of pricing.
The question particularly about prepaid, postpaid is it's a very important issue, and the United States and Western Europe and in parts of Asia have a lot of postpaid customers. But in many parts of the world, all you have is prepaid because there isn't a good billing system, if you will, to have a postpaid world. So there are different ways of paying for service, whether it's prepay or postpaid. And 10 years ago, the U.S. market was probably 80% postpaid, and today it's probably closer to 60-40, or even 50-50. Prepaid's become very popular. There's some firms that specialize more in prepaid. There are some firms that specialize more in postpaid. And there's no magic about one being better or worse than another. It's targeting different customer populations.
Interesting on that note, too, that at one point the commission, I believe during your tenure, the calling party pays debate, remember that
Yes.
There was an effort by some to get the commission to create a regime to allow for calling party pays and to get into the pricing regime of wireless, and ultimately was unsuccessful, but in part because completely overtaken by the marketplace itself. As the innovation in the pricing world overtook the need for regulatory intervention on calling party pays.
That's exactly right. The remnants of that tend to be on where you impose costs on consumers in roaming, international roaming, termination issues, and who winds up paying for those calls.
Some more questions from our audience? Always volunteer someone else.
Wow, stunned silence. Oh, here we go.
It's forthcoming around the corner.
Hi, I'm a neophyte here. I came to learn, but one question that my psyche is asking myself, I'm curious about how much spectrum is available and just who controls it and how will it, does the spectrum go around the whole Earth? And it's divided up by country, governments, and tell me more. And,
Sure. The spectrum does go all over the Earth. It is a natural resource that is in the same way that land isn't free. It's scarcity. Scarcity creates value, and each country assigns spectrum in slightly different ways. There's international coordination through the International Telecommunications Union for certain bands of spectrum to be sure that there aren't conflicting uses to different countries.
Another question here?
Hi, yes. I had a question about handset exclusivity contracts and whether you think there's a role that the FCC should play in, because now that devices have become so important to the consumer, and that's primarily oftentimes of what they're looking for. Do you think it would be important for the FCC to facilitate competition by having, by not allowing contracts or limiting them, or do you think that the market will naturally develop and get rid of those on their own, or are they actually a good thing to begin with?
I think allowing contracts between companies and customers tends to be a good thing, and this isn't unique to wireless handsets, where you typically will have a manufacturer will try to have an exclusive contract for a fixed period of time, say 12 months. Given that the life cycle of a handset might be 18 months at most, that's actually probably closer to 6 months exclusivity, and then you allow it to go to a broader market for some period of time. You know, this goes on in a wide range of things. Motion pictures have very complicated contracts, so you'll have motion picture theater exclusivity for the first week or two, and then it'll go into DVD or online to Netflix, and at some point it'll show up on HBO. But if you were to have, by regulation, to say you couldn't have exclusivity contracts for some period of time, then you would reduce investment in motion pictures. For the same reason, if you had regulation of exclusivity of handsets, you would have less investment in handsets. They just wouldn't be as profitable. And that would hurt consumers, because consumers are the ultimate beneficiary of having a lot of innovation and a lot of investment into handset manufacturing.
One thing I do starting striking about the debate is, there's often a lot of coverage of handset exclusivity vis-a-vis the AT&T iPhone is the most paradigmatic example. But people rarely talk about the dramatic failures where people have had exclusives. You know, nobody talks about the handsets where they signed contracts and put a lot of money into something that was a dog in the marketplace, and people risked and lost, which is an important flip side of this market, because it's about risk capital. And sometimes it pays off, and right. AT&T and the iPhone is a great example of that. But there are also a lot of failures out there, so it's a risky venture.
And different countries have different market expectations for it. In the United States, consumers typically purchase their handsets through their carrier, and the carrier finances it, if you will, with 1 or 2 year contracts. A lot of other countries, consumer purchases the handset separately and then goes to the wireless carrier. And then you pay the full upfront cost, but then you don't have carrier exclusivity.
A couple more questions. Zach, and then we'll go over here.
Hi, Zach Champ, PCIA. My question goes to, I guess, one part, the cloud. The cloud is syncing a lot of devices now. You're drawing a lot of your application data from remote servers. You're syncing across devices. And I think we're going to see more of that. At the same time, we're seeing unlimited data plans going away and data caps. I was wondering what you see as the economic effects of that on the marketplace and competition.
Again, I think the carriers are putting data caps on because of scarcity, that there's a real cost to them of providing the service, and it makes sense for them to ration that and to charge customers who use more of a service a higher rate, if you will. I don't see any economic inefficiency of that over time. I really don't. I've actually been surprised at how slow the carriers have been to put rate caps on. It's just you can have all you can eat when, in essence, the incremental cost of providing the service is zero, depending, no matter how much the consumer uses. And that rarely is the case. Usually, at some point, it really does cost the carriers more money to keep providing more service. In terms of how that affects, say, cloud computing, I'm not sure that it. Well, in fairness, I haven't really thought that through that carefully, so I'll hold off on an opinion on that. But I don't. It's not obvious to me that that's going to interfere with cloud computing. It really isn't.
Hi, Ed Wyatt, The New York Times. I feel like I remember from some of the analysis about the AT&T T-Mobile merger that per minute charges for mobile phone networks were lower in overseas markets than here in the U.S. Was that analysis correct, do you think? And if so, why is that? And if the analysis is not correct, can you tell me how?
So, I'm sorry, per minute charges, just can you repeat the assertion? Per minute?
Per minute charges.
Per minute for
per minute.
voice was greater in the United States than it was abroad.
I would have actually guessed it's the other way around. Typically, the U.S. rates are actually quite low on an international comparative basis. Voice is hard to measure because increasingly voice is not what's driving it. It may be more on some of the prepaid plans. The prepaid plans tend to be much more expensive than the postpaid plans on any unit measurement. But typically the U.S. rates have been very competitive internationally. So I'm not familiar with this, but I'd be happy to take a look at that in more detail if that would be helpful to you. That could be. China is very low.
They did that to have a lower cost for voice service, which comes with problems in other areas, but it does get the basic monthly voice charge way down.
Yeah, the China data is always fairly unreliable because the reporting is really hard. So that's been one recurring issue about how they can do international comparisons. And I happen to bring this with me, but according to CTIA, at the end of 10, we're the lowest cost per minute, lower than Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, Spain, Switzerland, Hungary, South Korea, Poland. Turkey's closest; they're at 5 cents a minute, and we're at 4. So I don't know what the data is, but at least according to CTIA, that at least they're charging. And that's a Merrill Lynch research published in April 11. So I don't know for sure. Other questions? All right.
This idea of calling a pricing plan a data cap, I don't think there's a data cap. I don't think anybody's forbidden to use more than, it's simply volume pricing.
Yes. Right.
It's just charging according to volume,
Right,
as
that's
opposed to charging regardless of volume. And
Right.
certainly, as the amount of volume is being used as for, everybody's watching movies and doing this and that, it seems to me certain that there's going to be there's going to have to be much more of that, because simply there's going to be a lot of variation among between consumers on the volume that they use. So you don't want to charge everybody the same price.
What has
But
happened?
nobody's being capped.
Right. This is all true. What has happened is with better technology, as you've moved from 2G to 3G to now to 4G, the ease of downloading, say, videos on your handset or on a tablet. A lot of people do it now because it's really easy, and the more people do it, the more data that goes through, and just the demand requirements on the network goes way up, and so that's become a real problem.
Well, and you're the economist, but I will venture and say there's also significant externalities because of the impact. Your use of the network impacts me if I'm sitting next to you, right? There is congestion issues that impact the quality of my experience. So it's another way to capture the externality caused by other people's use, because it's a shared network resource. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Or is it wrong way to say it?
No.
I'm playing economist. You know, you
No.
can play lawyer sometimes.
It's externality. Maybe it's a shared resource, and you want to get the pricing right so that each individual is bearing their fair share of it.
Fair enough. All right, with that, we have a final follow-up. A question cap is coming next.
However, it does, I mean, you're the expert, but on these questions of pricing and volume pricing in the cloud and so forth, it does seem to me that there's one big problem in this area, and that is the shortage of spectrum, which is highly artificial, given that these wireless uses are being starved while we have enormous swaths of spectrum allocated to things that are essentially useless. And if we had as much spectrum allocated as was suitable for the amount of demand, it's likely that a lot of the sort of constraint, I can hear in the background of a lot of these questions, people are kind of worried about these constraints, and it seems to me that the most important one is completely artificial and unnecessary and wasteful, and that we could have a lot more capacity at lower price if we fixed one big problem in the background. That was a speech, but it was really a question. Do you agree with that, Commissioner?
Isn't it true?
Yes.
All right. With that, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. A round of applause for Harold and his presentation. Very informative. And we'll look forward to seeing you back here, or next presentation,
July
18th. 18th.
Rousseau and Corrupt.
Excellent. Have a good evening.